Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're jumping into something pretty deep, actually. A topic that, well, it touches nearly everyone, often without us even realizing it. We're calling it the trauma loop, how childhood pain creates adult patterns. And our mission here really is to dig into the source material you shared with us. We want to unpack the key insights. We want to understand why people get stuck in these repeating cycles of, well, pain, frankly. But more importantly, how do you actually break free? We'll be looking at this through, psychology, but also touching on some really interesting brain science, some neurological stuff. So maybe let's start with a question that probably resonates with a lot of you listening. Why do certain challenges, certain difficult patterns just seem to repeat over and over in our lives, like we're stuck on some kind of invisible script?
Okay, so that's the core idea, this trauma loop. For listeners maybe hearing this term for the first time, how are we defining trauma here? And what exactly is this loop? Because we do see it, don't we? People going through the same relationship problems, same career hurdles, again and again.
It really is like a broken record sometimes. What's actually going on under the hood?
Yeah, it's fascinating and maybe a bit unsettling how the sources define trauma. It's not just the big obvious events, the capital T trauma. It's often described more like emotional fragmentation. This could come from things that seem less dramatic on the surface, like ongoing emotional neglect, or feeling abandoned, or even growing up with conditional love, where you learn basically that your worth depends on behaving a certain way. And the loop, that's the subconscious just replaying that unresolved emotional pain. It's like an echo that keeps bouncing around inside.
Right, so it's not necessarily one big bang, but maybe a persistent emotional static that never got tuned out.
Right.
But I'm still kind of grappling with this idea that the brain might prefer familiar pain. That sounds so backward. Is it really preference?
Oh,
or more like a default setting? It's hard to change. Can you unpack the brain science bit there?
You're right. To push on that, it does sound completely counterintuitive. And preference is maybe not the right word. It's more about deeply ingrained pathways. Think of neural pathways in your brain like hiking trails. Now imagine one trail is muddy, thorny, generally unpleasant, but if it's the only trail you've ever known, your brain just defaults to it.
Oh.
It sticks to the familiar, even if it's uncomfortable, because the unknown path, even a potentially smoother one, feels uncertain, maybe even dangerous from the brain's perspective.
Wow.
It's kind of shocking, isn't it? That our own brain can lock onto that familiarity even when it causes pain. These pathways, these connections, they get strengthened by repetition. And emotional memory is huge here too. Experiences, especially the really emotionally charged ones from the past, get etched in deep. If that original pain wasn't fully processed, the brain often unconsciously might seek out situations that feel similar. It's almost like it's trying to understand it, or maybe finally get it right this time.
Try to resolve it in a way.
Yeah, exactly. So looking at the bigger picture, these repeating patterns aren't necessarily a sign of weakness. They're often a very deep subconscious attempt to heal something left unresolved.
It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? Have you seen these kinds of patterns in your own life? Maybe in people you know?
That paints a really vivid picture, the brain clinging to the known, even the painful known. It is unsettling. So if the loop relies on this known, these ingrained pathways, where does it all begin? Does it really all trace back to childhood, those early years? Yeah, childhood is absolutely where the foundations get laid. Early experiences create these incredibly powerful subconscious beliefs. They literally shape how we see ourselves in the world, like, a child who's constantly criticized might deeply internalize, I'm unlovable, or I'm just not good enough. Or maybe a child whose successes were met with envy or indifference might learn something like, success is dangerous, or it's safer to stay small. And it's not always the big dramatic stuff we were talking about earlier. The sources really emphasize the impact of more subtle trauma. Things like constantly being told, be strong, don't cry. That teaches a kid, push your feelings down.
Right, suppress everything.
Or always needing to get approval from parents or teachers that teaches you your value comes from outside yourself, not from within.
That really shifts the perspective, doesn't it? It's not just about what happened, but maybe even more about what didn't happen, what was missing.
Precisely. The source material talks a lot about parent-child dynamics, and one phrase really stood out. What wasn't said is often more damaging than what was. Think about the emotional voids, the needs that just weren't met, maybe never even acknowledged. That silence, that absence can carve deep patterns too. Our nervous system is like a sponge in childhood, soaking all this up, imprinting it. And this early conditioning means, as adults, we can react to things happening now as if we're still that kid back then, often without even realizing it.
Wow.
So it's really useful for you, the listener, to maybe reflect what personal truths about yourself and the world might have been shaped by those early lessons, spoken or unspoken.
That's a heavy thought, how these early, maybe invisible lessons become our internal rule book. Okay, so if these loops start in childhood, how do we spot them in action now in our adult lives? What are the specific signs, the behaviors that suggest someone might be, unconsciously replaying those old tapes?
Well, stepping back, you can see these patterns showing up across different areas of life. Relationships are a big one. You might find yourself repeatedly drawn to partners who are, say, emotionally unavailable or overly critical, maybe echoing an early dynamic. At work, it could look like a constant struggle with authority figures, or maybe driving yourself relentlessly with perfectionism, leading to burnout.
Yeah, I could see that.
Problems with boundaries, too, either being way too rigid, walling everyone out, or having almost no boundaries at all, getting easily overwhelmed or taken advantage of, or just emotionally shutting down when conflict arises. That's another common one. And one really interesting point the sources make is about those moments where we feel like we overreact.
Yes.
Often, that huge emotional surge isn't really about the current situation. It's an old wound getting poked, and the intensity of the reaction belongs to the past, not the present trigger.
So those times you feel completely flooded or just disproportionately angry or upset, that might actually be a younger version of you stepping forward, reacting to an old hurt.
Exactly right. And sometimes trauma gets really cleverly disguised, almost like personality traits. A chronic people pleaser. That might stem from a childhood where love and safety felt conditional on making everyone else happy.
Makes sense.
Or someone with persistent rage issues that could be years of unprocessed anger from feeling powerless or unseen as a child. Withdrawal, pulling away from connection, that could be a learned defense mechanism, a way to avoid potential pain based on past experiences. And then there are other common signs the sources list, things like addictions, often used to numb that underlying pain, control issues trying to control the external world because internally or in the past things felt so out of control, a deep pervasive fear of abandonment is another big one, and chronic guilt, this feeling of being inherently flawed or somehow responsible for everything bad that happens. So it really invites you to look, do any of these patterns resonate? Do they show up in your daily choices, your emotional reactions?
That definitely gives us a lot of clear markers to look for. It's quite revealing. Which brings us to the really crucial question, the hopeful one. Can this loop actually be broken? Is it possible to get off this repeating track? What does the psychology of healing look like? What are the practical steps someone can take to start dismantling these patterns?
Yes. Emphatically, yes, the loop can be broken. It's not easy, but it's absolutely possible. And the very first step, the key that unlocks the door, is awareness. You just can't change something if you don't even see it happening.
Right. Got to see the pattern first.
Exactly. Acknowledging it is huge. Then, once you start seeing the pattern, the next really vital step is allowing yourself to feel what maybe you weren't allowed to feel back then. This emotional release is critical. Letting those trapped emotions, sadness, anger, fear, finally move through you instead of staying lodged inside, driving those old reactions. And there are many tools, many approaches to support this healing. The sources mention several. Things like inner child work, consciously connecting with and nurturing those younger parts of yourself that were wounded or neglected. Journaling is a powerful tool too. Just getting thoughts and feelings out onto paper can be incredibly clarifying and releasing. Then there's somatic therapy. This is really interesting. It works with the body, recognizing that trauma gets stored physically. So it might involve things like mindful movement, breath work, maybe gentle touch, helping the body release those stored tensions and memories.
Working with the body's memory, not just the mind's.
Precisely. And guided visualization can also be helpful, kind of mentally rehearsing new responses or offering compassion to your past self.
That idea you mentioned, reparenting yourself, that sounds incredibly powerful, like giving your younger self what they missed out on.
It really is. Reparenting is about consciously providing yourself now with the emotional support, the understanding, the validation, maybe the unconditional acceptance that you didn't get enough of back then. It's like becoming the wise, compassionate parent your own inner child needed. Another really important concept from the sources is about integrating your shadow. These are the parts of ourselves we often disown or push away because we learned they were unacceptable. feel. Maybe anger, vulnerability, ambition, sadness. By bringing these aspects into the light, acknowledging them, accepting them, we become more whole, and they stop driving our behavior from the shadows unconsciously.
Instead of fighting those parts, you integrate them.
Exactly. And the sources pose this really interesting idea. What happens when you finally turn towards the pain, not with judgment or fear, but with curiosity, just being open, asking, what is this feeling trying to tell me? That shift in perspective from criticism to curiosity can be the very beginning of real freedom.
Freedom, that sounds, well, incredibly liberating, as you say. And thinking about it, this isn't just about freeing ourselves individually, is it? You mentioned echoes. When one person heals, surely that creates ripples outwards. How does breaking our own cycle affect, say, our families, maybe even future generations? What does it mean to actually end generational trauma?
Yeah, this is where it gets really profound, the wider impact.
Yeah.
When you heal these patterns in yourself, you're not just doing it for you. You are actively stopping them from being passed down.
You're breaking the chain.
Precisely. The sources talk about how these unconscious patterns get inherited emotionally. It's not just genetics, Fingit. Think about the unspoken family rules, the emotional climate, the typical ways of relating these things get transmitted across generations, often without anyone ever consciously choosing them.
Wow, yeah.
They shape family dynamics, sometimes for decades or longer. So things like conscious parenting, which comes from a parent doing their own inner work, become incredibly powerful tools. They offer children a fundamentally different, healthier emotional blueprint.
So it seems like one person having the courage to face their own stuff and heal can literally change the emotional legacy of their entire family line.
Absolutely. The ripple effect is huge. It changes your current relationships with partners, friends, colleagues. It creates healthier family dynamics right now. And yes, it leaves a different legacy for the future. The sources talk about becoming a pattern breaker. And they acknowledge, there's a weight to that, a responsibility, but also grace is needed. It's about choosing consciously not to repeat the hurts you experienced or witnessed.
It's a significant role to step into.
It is. It's definitely a journey, not like flipping a switch. So for you listening, maybe consider, what would it really mean for you to be the first in your family line to not pass on a particular pattern of pain? And how could you carry that responsibility forward, with both strength and self-compassion?
What an incredible arc we've covered today. Really, from understanding how these trauma loops get started, often subtly, in childhood, to seeing how they show up, sometimes hidden in plain sight, in our adult lives.
Yeah.
And finally, exploring the very real possibility, the hope of breaking free. And not just for ourselves, but creating those positive ripples outwards.
So maybe a final thought to carry with you, something the sources really prompt us to consider. What's one belief, just one, that you picked up in your childhood that you might be ready to start questioning now after exploring all this?
Yeah, that's a powerful question to sit with. Maybe journal about it, like we mentioned, or just let it percolate as you go about your week. Continuing to reflect on these themes, even gently, can open up some really amazing new possibilities for growth and for healing. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive today.